Defamation research case studies. What is defamation? Defamation is a written or spoken false statement that subjects someone to hatred or ridicule or injures a person's occupation or business. Defamation can be either slander or liberal. Slander is a spoken false statement that damages a person's reputation. For example, telling someone that a certain person has a transmitted sexual disease. Liberal is a written or public false statement that damages a person's reputation. For example, a photo published of a celebrity depicting the truth of what occurred in the photo. In the case New York Times versus Sullivan, Lester Bruce Sullivan was the plaintiff and the New York Times was the defendant. Sullivan was one of the 3 elected commissioners in Montgomery, Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement. The New York Times published an ad, Heed Their Voices, in efforts to raise money for Martin Luther King Jr. The ad was endorsed by a large amount of people and presented true as well as false statements about the police department. The ad never mentioned Sullivan directly, but he argued that as Commissioner of Public Affairs, which oversaw the police department, fire department, department of cemetery, and department scales, the allegations made the police department were damaging to his reputation because they were under his command. Sullivan filed the lawsuit under Alabama's liberal state law. The law requires that the ad to be removed by requesting a retraction from the public official. The Times refused to retract the ad. However, Sullivan was awarded $500,000 by jury in the Circuit Court of Montgomery County with the Supreme Court of Alabama affirmation. Sullivan's decision was overturned due to the Alabama law that denies a public officer recovery of punitive damages in a liberal action brought on the account of a publication concerning his official conduct unless he first makes a written demand for a public retraction and the defendant fails or refuses to comply. Since the Times did comply by refusing, Sullivan, as a public official, had to prove that the Times acted with direct malice. There is no evidence of this. Gertz versus Welch. Gertz versus Robert Welch, Inc. Elmer Gertz was the practitioner. Gertz was an attorney representing the family of Nelson, a youth killed by Chicago policemen. Robert Welch was a magazine publisher who falsely stated that the murder trial was a communist conspiracy to discredit the local police and that Gertz arranged narcos frame-up. The article also implied that Gertz was a communist frontier with a criminal record. Gertz was considered a private person in the case. There was no proof that Gertz was any of the defamatory statements made in the American Opinion article, although he was a member and officer of the National Lawyers Guild 15 years earlier. There was no evidence that he or that organization had taken any part in planning the 1968 demolitions in Chicago. The false allegations, according to Gertz, injured his reputation as a lawyer and citizen. Since his statement had to do with his work ethic by labeling him as violent and a communist, his professionalism as a lawyer was being questioned. He also, in turn, suffered public hatred. In order to avoid the lawsuit in Welch's case, I would have researched Gertz in a more profound state. For example, if the organization of the National Lawyers Guild had taken part in the demolitions in 1968, I would have just mentioned that Gertz was a member at the time. However, I would not have applied that he took part himself, but it could be understood he agreed with such actions by being a member. In South Carolina, the elements of a defamation claim are a false statement concerning the plaintiff, the state was published to a third party, the statement was defamatory, the person who released the statement was at fault, and the plaintiff was damaged as a result of the statement. In my future work within the communications industry, I will be mindful of the laws of defamation. Although I have a right to freedom of speech, I will be aware that before publishing anything, that proper research has been conducted with supporting evidence. In terms of publication for private figures, I will be sure that all resources are accredited with a direct interview from the private figure, if possible.